Hi, and welcome to the Lambda Audiobooks channel. You are listening to the audiobook, The Return by Walter de Mare. This chapter is titled Chapter 6. Beginning chapter. There were 3 books in the room. Jeremy Taylor's Holy Living and Dying, a volume of The Quiver, and a little gilded book on wildflowers. He read in vain. He lay and listened to the uproar of his thoughts, on which an occasional sound, the droning of a fly, the cry of a milkman, the noise of a passing van, obtruded from the workaday world. The pale gold sunlight edged softly over the bed. He ate up everything on his tray. He even, on the shoals of nightmare, dreamed a while. But by and by, as the hours wheeled slowly on, he grew less calm, less strenuously resolved on lying there inactive. Every sparrow that twittered cried reveal through his brain. He longed with an ardor strange to his temperament to be up and doing. What if his misfortune was, as he had in the excitement of the moment suggested to Sheila, only a morbid delusion of mind, shared too in part by sheer force of his absurd confession? Even if he was going mad, who knows how peaceful a release that might not be? Could his shrew vicar have implicitly believed in him if the change were as complete as he supposed it? He flung off the bedclothes and locked the door. He dressed himself, noticing, he fancied, with a deadly revulsion of feeling, that his coat was a little too short in the sleeves, his waistcoat too loose. In the midst of his dressing came Sheila bringing his luncheon. "I'm sorry," he called out, stooping quickly beside the bed. "I can't talk now. Please put the tray down." About half an hour afterwards he heard the outer door close, and peeping from behind the curtains saw his wife go out. All was drowsily quiet in the house. He devoured his lunch like a schoolboy. That finished to the last crumb, without a moment's delay, he covered his face with a towel, locked the door behind him, put the key in his pocket, and ran lightly downstairs. He stuffed the towel into an ulster pocket, put on a soft, wide-brimmed hat, and noiselessly let himself out. Then he turned with an almost hysterical delight and ran like the wind, without posing, without thinking, straight on, up one turning, down another, until he reached a broad open common, thickly wooded, sprinkled with gorse and hazel and may, and faintly purple with fading heather. There he flung himself down in the beautiful sunlight, among the yellowing bracken, to recover his breath. He lay there for many minutes, thinking almost with composure. Flight, it seemed, had for the moment quietened the demands of that other feebly struggling personality which was beginning to insinuate itself into his consciousness, which had so miraculously broken in and taken possession of his body. He would not think now. All he needed was a little quiet and patience before he threw off for good and all his right to be free, to be his own master, to call himself sane. He scrambled up and turned his face towards the westering sun. What was there in the stillness of its beautiful splendor that seemed to sharpen his horror and difficulty, and yet to stir him to such a daring and devilry as he had never known? Since he was a boy, there was little sound of life. Somewhere an unknown bird was singing, and a few late bees were droning in the bracken. All these years he had, like an old blind horse, stolidly plodded round and round in a dull self-set routine. And now, just when the spirit had come for rebellion, the mood for a harmless truancy, there had fallen with them to this hideous enigma. He sat there with the dusky silhouette of the face that was now drenched with sunlight in his mind's eye. He set off again up the stony incline. Why not walk on and on? In time, real wholesome weariness would come. He could sleep at ease in some pleasant wayside inn, without once meeting the eyes that stood as it were like a window between himself and a shrewd, incredulous, scoffing world that would turn him into a monstrosity and his story into a fable. And in a little while, perhaps in 3 days, he would awaken out of this engrossing nightmare and know he was free, this black dog gone from his back, and, as the old saying expressed it without any one dreaming what it really meant, his own man again. How astonished Sheila would be! How warmly she would welcome him! Oh yes, of course she would. He came again to a standstill. No voice of him out of that illimitable gold and blue. Nothing seemed aware of him. But as he stood there, doubtful as Cain on the outskirts of the unknown, he caught the sound of a footfall on the lonely and stone-strewn path. The ground sloped steeply away to the left, and slowly mounting the hillside came mildly on an old lady he knew, a Miss Sinnott, an old friend of his mother's. There was just such a little seat as that other he knew so well, on the brow of the hill. He made his way to it, intending to sit quietly there until the little old lady had passed by. Up and up she came. Her large bonnet appeared, and then her mild white face inclined a little towards him as she ascended. Evidently this very seat was her goal, and evasion was impossible. Evasion, Memory rushed back and set his pulses beating. He turned boldly to the sun, and the old lady, with a brief glance into his face, composed herself at the other end of the little seat. She gazed out of a gentle reverie into the golden valley, and so they sat a while, and almost as if she had felt the bond of acquaintance between them, she presently sighed, and addressed him. "A very, very beautiful view, sir." Lawford posed, then turned a gloomy, earnest face, gilded with sunshine. "Beautiful, indeed," he said, "but not for me. No, Miss Sinnott, not for me." The old lady gravely turned and examined the aquiline profile. "Well, I confess," she remarked urbanely, you have the advantage of me." Lawford smiled uneasily. "Believe me, it is little advantage. My sight," said Miss Sinnott precisely, "is not so good as I might wish, though better perhaps than I might have hoped. I fear I am not much wiser. Your face is still unfamiliar to me." "It is not unfamiliar to me," said Lawford. Whose trickery was this, he thought, putting such affected stuff into his mouth? A faint lightning of pity came into the silvery and scrupulous countenance. "Oh, dear me, yes," she said courteously. Lawford rested a lean hand on the seat. "And have you," he asked, "not the least recollection in the world of my face?" "Now really," she said, smiling blandly, "is that quite fair? Think of all the scores and scores of faces in 70 long years, and how very treacherous memory is. You shall do me the service of reminding me of one whose name has for the moment escaped me. I am the son of a very old friend of yours, Miss Sinnott," said Lawford quietly, "a friend that was once your schoolfellow at Brighton." "Well, now," said the old lady, grasping her umbrella. That is undoubtedly a clue. But then, you see, all but one of the friends of my girl are dead, and if I have never had the pleasure of meeting her son, unless there is a decided resemblance, how am I to recollect her by looking at him? There is, I believe, a likeness, said Lawford. She nodded her great bonnet at him with gentle amusement. You are insistent in your fancy. Well, let me think again. The last to leave me was Fanny Urquhart. That was, let me see, last October. Now you are certainly not Fanny Urquhart's son. Oh, she stooped austerely, for she never had one. Last year, too, I heard that my dear Mrs. Jameson was dead. Her I hadn't met for many, many years. But, if I may venture to say so, yours is not a Scottish face, and she not only married a Scottish husband, but was herself a Dunbar. No, I am still at a loss. A miserable strife was in her chance companion's mind, a strife of anger and recrimination. He turned his eyes warily to the fast declining sun. You will forgive my persistence, but I assure you it is a matter of life or death to me. Is there no one my face recalls? My voice. Miss Sinnett drew her long lips together, her eyebrows lifted with the faintest perturbation. But he certainly knows my name, she said to herself. She turned once more, and in the still autumnal beauty, beneath that pale blue arch of evening, these two human beings confronted one another again. She eyed him blandly, yet with a certain grave directness. I don't really think, she said, you can be Mary Lawford's son. I could scarcely have mistaken him. Lawford gulped and turned away. He hardly knew what this surge of feeling meant. Was it hope, despair, resentment? Had he caught even the echo of an unholy joy? His mind for a moment became confused as if in the tumult of a struggle. He heard himself expostulate. "Ah, Miss Bennet, I fear I set you too difficult a task." The old lady drew abruptly in, like a trustful and gentle snail into its shocked house. "Bennet, sir, but my name is not Bennet." And again Lawford accepted the miserable prompting. "Not Bennet, eh? How can I ever then apologize for so frantic a mistake?" The little old lady took firm hold of her umbrella. She did not answer him. The likeness. He began unctuously, and stopped, for the glance that dwelt fleetingly on him was cold with the formidable dignity and displeasure of age. He raised his hat and turned miserably home. He strode on out of the last gold into the blue twilight. What fantastic foolery of mind was mastering him? He cast a hurried look over his shoulder at the kindly and offended old figure sitting there, solitary, on the little seat, in her great bonnet, with back turned resolutely upon him, the friend of his dead mother who might have proved in his need a friend indeed to him. And he had by this insane caprice hopelessly estranged her. She would remember this face well enough now, he thought bitterly, and would take her place among his quiet enemies, if ever the day of reckoning should come. It was scandalous, it was banal to have abused her trust and courtesy. Oh, it was hopeless to struggle any more. The fates were against him. They had played him a trick. He was to be their transitory sport, as many a better man he could himself recollect had been before him. He would go home and give in, let Sheila do with him what she pleased. No one but a lunatic could have acted as he had, with just that frantic hint of method so remarkable in the insane. He left the common. A lamplighter was lighting the lamps. A thin evening haze was on the air. If only he had stayed at home that fateful afternoon! What had induced him, enticed him to venture out? And even with the thought welled up into his mind an intense desire to go to the old green time-worn churchyard again, to sit there contentedly alone, where none heeded the completest metamorphosis, down beside the yew trees. What a fool he had been! There alone, of course, lay his only possible chance of recovery. He would go to Mare. Perhaps Sheila had not yet discovered his absence, and there would be no difficulty in repeating so successful a stratagem. Remembrance of his miserable mistake, of Miss Sinnett, faintly returned to him as he swiftly mounted the steps to his port. Poor old lady! He would make amends for his discourtesy when he was quite himself again. She'd some day hear, perhaps, his infinitely tragic, infinitely comic experience from his own lips. He would take her some flowers, some old keepsake of his mother's. What would he not do when the old moods and brains of the stupid Arthur Lawford, whom he had appreciated so little and so superficially, came back to him? He ran up the steps and stopped dead, his hand in his pocket, chilled and aghast. Sheila had taken his keys. He stood there, dazed and still, beneath the dim yellow of his own fanlight, and once again that inward spring flew back. Brazen it out, brazen it out. Knock and ring, and he knocked flamboyantly, and ran. There came a quiet step, and the door opened. "Der Simon, of course, has called. Have—" he inquired suavely. "Yes, sir." "Oh, and gone, as I feared. And Mrs. Lawford?" "I think Mrs. Lawford is in, sir." Lawford put out a detaining hand. "We will not disturb her. We will not disturb her. I can find my way up. Oh, yes, thank you." But Ada still pallidly barred the way. "I think, sir," she said, "Mrs. Lawford would prefer to see you herself. She told me most particularly all callers." And Mr. Lawford was not to be disturbed on any account. Disturbed? God forbid, said Lawford, but his dark eyes failed to move these lightest hazel. "Well," he continued nonchalantly, perhaps it would be as well if Mrs. Lawford should know that I am here. No, thank you, I won't come in. Please go and tell." Even as the maid turned to obey, Sheila herself appeared at the dining-room door in hat and veil. Lawford hesitated an immeasurable moment. In one swift glance he perceived the lamplit mystery of evening, beckoning, calling, pleading, "Fly, fly. Home's here for you. Begin again, begin again." And there before him in quiet and hostile decorum stood maid and mistress. He took off his hat and stepped quickly in. "So late, so very late, I fear," he began glibly. A sudden call, a perfectly impossible distance. "Shall we disturb him? do you think? Wouldn't it, began Sheila softly, be rather a pity, perhaps? Simon seemed to think. But, of course, you must decide that. Ada turned quiet small eyes. No, no, by no means, he almost mumbled. And a hard, slow smile passed over Sheila's face. Excuse me one moment, she said. I will see if he is awake. She swept swiftly forward, superb and triumphant, beneath the gaze of those dark, restless eyes. But so still was home and street that quite distinctly a clear and youthful laughter was heard, and light footsteps approaching. Sheila paused. Ada, in the act of closing the door, peered out. Miss Alice, ma'am, she said. And in this infinitesimal advantage of time, Ferguson had seized his vanishing opportunity, and was already swiftly mounting the stairs. Mrs. Lawford stood with veil half raised and coldly smiling lips, and, as if it were by prearrangement, her daughter's laughing greeting from the garden, and from the landing above her, a faint "Oh, and how are we now?" broke out simultaneously. And Ada, silent and discreet, had thrown open the door again to the twilight and to the young people ascending the steps. Lawford was still sitting on his bed before a cold and ashy hearth when Sheila knocked at the door. Yes, he said. Who's there? No answer followed. He rose with a shuddering sigh and turned the key. His wife entered. That little exhibition of fairness was part of our agreement, I suppose. I say, began Lawford. To creep out in my absence like a thief, and to return like a mountebank, that was part of our compact. I say, he stubbornly began again, did you wire for Alice? Will you please answer my question? Am I to be a mere catspaw in your intrigues, in this miserable masquerade before the servants? To set the whole place ringing with the name of a doctor that doesn't exist, and a bedridden patient that slips out of the house with his bedroom key in his pocket? Are you aware that Ada has been hammering at your door every half-hour absence? Are you aware of that? How much, she continued in a low, bitter voice, how much should I offer for her discretion? Who was that with Alice? Inquired the same toneless voice. I refuse to be ignored. I refuse to be made a child of. Will you please answer me? Lawford turned. Look here, Sheila, he began heavily. What about Alice? If you wired, well, it's useless to say anything more. But if you didn't, I ask you just one thing. Don't tell her. Oh, I perfectly appreciate a father's natural anxiety. Her husband drew up his shoulders as if to receive a blow. Yes, yes, he said, but you won't. The sound of a young laughing voice came faintly up from below. How did Jimmy Fortescue know she was coming home today? Will you not inquire of Jimmy Fortescue for yourself? Oh, what is the use of sneering? Began the dull voice again. I am horribly tired, Sheila. And try how you will, you can't convince me that you believe for a moment that I am not myself, that you are as hard as you pretend. And an acquaintance, even a friend, might be deceived, but husband and wife. Oh no, it isn't only a man's face that's himself, or even his hands. He looked at them. Straightened them slowly out, and buried them in his pockets. All I care about now's Alice. Is she, or is she not going to be told? I am simply asking you to give her just a chance. Simply asking me to give Alice a chance. Now isn't that really just a little, eh? Lawford slowly shook his head. You know in your heart it isn't, Sheila. You understand me quite well, although you persistently pretend not to. I can't argue now. I can't speak up for myself. I am just about as far down as I can go. It's only Alice. I see. A lucid interval, suggested his wife in a low, trembling voice. Yes, if you like, said her husband patiently. A lucid interval. Don't please look at my face like that, Sheila. Think that it's just lupus, just some horrible disfigurement. Not much light was in the large room, and there was something so extraordinarily characteristic of her husband in those stooping shoulders, in the head hung a little forward, and in the preternaturally solemn voice, that Sheila had to bend a little over the bed to catch a glimpse of the sallow and keener face again. She sighed, and even on her own strained ear sigh sounded almost like one of relief. It's useless, I know, to ask you anything while you are in this mood, continued Lawford dully. I know that of old. The white, ringed hands clenched. Of old. I didn't mean anything. Don't listen to what I say. It's just Alice knowing, that was all. I mean at once. Don't for a moment suppose I am not perfectly aware that it is only Alice you think of. You were particularly anxious about my feelings, weren't you? You broke the news to me with the tenderest solicitude. I am glad our daughter shares my husband's love. Look here, said Lawford densely. You know that I love you as much as ever, but with this, as I am, what would be the good of my saying so? Mrs. Lawford took a deep breath, and a voice called softly at the door, Mother, are you there? Is father awake? May I come in? In a flash the memory returned to her. 24 hours ago she was asking that very question of this unspeakable figure that sat hunched up before her. One moment, dear, she called, and added in a very low voice, come here. Lawford looked up. What? He said. Perhaps, she whispered, it isn't quite so bad. For mercy's sake, Sheila, he said, don't torture me. Tell the poor child to go away. She posed. Are you there, Alice? Would you mind, father says, waiting a little? He is so very tired. Too tired to. Oh, very well, mother. Mrs. Lawford opened the door and called after her, Is Jimmy gone? Oh, yes, ours. Where did you meet? I couldn't get a carriage at the station. He carried my dressing bag. I begged him not to. The others coming on. You know what Jimmy is. How very, very lucky I did come home. I don't know what made me, just an impulse. They did laugh at me so. Father dear, do speak to me. How are you now? Lawford opened his mouth, gulped, and shook his head. Shh, dear, whispered Sheila. I think he has fallen asleep. I will be down in a minute. Mrs. Lawford was about to close the door when Ada appeared. If you please, ma'am, she said, I have been waiting, as you told me, to let Der Ferguson out, but it's nearly 7 now, and the table's not laid yet. I really should have thought, Ada, Sheila began, then caught back the angry words, and turned and looked over her shoulder into the room. Do you think you will need anything more, Der Ferguson? She asked in a sepulchral voice. Again, Lawford's lips moved. Again, he shook his head. One moment, Ada, she said, closing the door. Some more medicine. What medicine? Quick. She mustn't suspect. What medicine? What? Repeated Lawford stolidly. Oh, vexing, vexing. Don't you see? Must send her out. Don't you see? What was it you sent to Critchett's for last night? Tell him that's gone. We want more of that. Lawford stared heavily. Oh, yes, yes, he said thickly. More of that. Sheila, with a shrug of extreme distaste and vexation, hastily opened the door. Der Ferguson wants a further supply of the drug which Mr. Critchett made up for Mr. Lawford yesterday evening. You had better go at once, Ada, and please make as much haste as you possibly can. I say, began Lawford, but it was too late. The door was shut. How I detest this wretched falsehood and subterfuge. What could have induced you? Yes, said her husband. What? I think I will be getting to bed again. Sheila, I forgot I had been ill, and now I do really feel very tired. But I should like to feel, in spite of this hideous, I should like to feel we are friends. Sheila almost imperceptibly shuddered, crossed the room, and faced the still, almost lifeless mask. I spoke, she said, in a low, cold, difficult voice. I spoke in a temper this morning. You must try to understand what a shock it has been to me. Now, I own it frankly. I know you are, Arthur. But God only knows how it frightens me, and horrifies me. She shut her eyes beneath her veil. They waited on in silence a while. Poor boy, she said at last, lightly touching the loose sleeve. Be brave, it will all come right, soon. Meanwhile, for Alice's sake, if not for mine, don't give way to caprices, and all that. Keep quietly here, Arthur, and forgive my impatience. He put out his hand, as if to touch her. Forgive you, he said humbly, pushing it stubbornly back into his pocket again. Oh, Sheila, the forgiveness is all on your side. You know I have nothing to forgive. A long silence fell between them. Then, tonight, at last began Sheila wearily, drawing back. We say nothing to Alice. except that you are too tired, just nervous prostration, to see her. What we should do without this influenza, I cannot conceive. Mr. Bethany will probably look in on his way home, and then we can talk it over. We can talk it over again. So long as you are like this, yourself, in mind, what is it now? She broke off querulously. If you please, ma'am, Mr. Critchett says he doesn't know Der Ferguson. His name's not in the directory, and there must be something wrong with the message, and he's sorry, but he must have it in writing because there was more even in the first packet than he ought by rights to send. What shall I do, if you please? Still looking at her husband, Sheila listened quietly to the end, and then, as if in inarticulate disdain, she deliberately shrugged her shoulders and went out to play her part unaided. End of chapter. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. If you are interested in hearing more audiobooks, subscribe and turn on the notifications to get fresh daily audiobook chapters from Lambda Audiobooks. Until next time.